In World War II, Admiral Ramsay was recalled from semi-retirement. He became Flag Officer Dover, and so as the evacuation for Dunkirk happened, he was the guy there in charge of it. They thought that 40,000 people might have been rescued from the beaches and from France out of the British Expeditionary Force. In fact, he and his team and ships, military and naval, and of course the little ships, they between them rescued 338,000 men of mainly British and French armies. And that was considered crucial because they were the professionally trained soldiers who were then able to form the backbone of the British Army for the rest of the war. He was then put in charge of the North African landing, planning those in 1942, and then in 1943 he planned the Sicilian landings. That then led on to him having had all this amphibious expertise and knowledge to be put in charge of the naval side of the D-Day landings, called Operation Neptune. And so the Allied commander was General Eisenhower, who then became Field Marshal and then President of the US, and he was in charge of the Navy, the Allied navies. There were 7 navies under him. Operation Neptune was the plans for the landing of a big enough force to recapture France and move into Germany. And so I believe that the orders that were given were hugely thick. It was hugely complicated. The planning detail was immense. If you can just imagine, there were several thousand ships, I think 4,000 or 5,000 involved in the landings, and they had to be all placed at different ports around the southern part of the UK, and they had to leave at the specific time to be able to arrive at the beaches in the right order, and that's just one example of how much planning was required. It went well, as we now know, and thank goodness for that, but for the leaders who were doing this planning, they didn't know it was going to be a success. So the worry and the huge concern for the troops that they were sending into battle must have been immense. The weather was definitely a hurdle, but there was enough of a window for them to land one day after they had originally planned to land. And it went well. They, in the first 9 days, they landed 500,000 troops and 77,000 vehicles. And I mentioned 9 days because that's the comparison with Dunkirk, where he brought back 1/3 soldiers, and then 4 years later he sent back to France 500,000. An indication of the pressure that these leaders must have felt is a quote that I found of my grandfather's. A few days before D-Day, the ships were loading in Portsmouth Harbour, and he said, "Here is a scene set for terrible human sacrifice. But if out of it comes peace and happiness, who would want it otherwise?" And so he knew, as did the other leaders, that people were going to die, and they must have felt just a huge sense of responsibility for that. Churchill said to his wife on the eve of D-Day, "When you wake up in the morning, there may be 20,000 soldiers killed." In reality, there were 1/4 of that lost their lives tragically on D-Day. In fact, it was 4,414 troops made the ultimate sacrifice. The D-Day landings were the launch pad for ending the war. They had to retake Germany and defeat Hitler and the Nazis. And this was their key plan to do it. They had scenario planned what would they next do if D-Day had failed, and they reckoned it would be at least a year, if not 2 years, before they would be able to launch a subsequent operation which could do that. So if it had failed, the war may have ended a year or two later with further deaths in that period. Operation Neptune wasn't just about the first day, it was about the whole battle for Normandy. And the Royal Navy and the other Allied navies, they had to land more men and equipment than the Germans were able to move into Normandy. And that was crucial. It was a numbers game. And so the logistical effort was so important over, well, it was 2 months until the Battle of Normandy was won. And I think there were 73,000 Allied soldiers died in the Battle for Normandy. There had been all that strain leading up to D-Day itself, and there wasn't any relief of that because they had to keep landing troops, landing equipment for a very prolonged period to build up the troops on the continent to be able to defeat the Germans. So I think the mental exhaustion, the many hours they had to put in behind the scenes, yes, of course, there was all that physical courage which those troops in the line of fire had to face, but I think one shouldn't forget the moral courage, the mental exhaustion that those behind the scenes had to face. He moved his headquarters to France, and it was from there, on the 2nd of January, he had to go and meet General Montgomery to plan the next phase of the advance into Germany. His plane took off to go for this meeting and sadly crashed on takeoff, and they were all killed. So he sadly, my grandfather sadly never got to see the end of the war. His wife and children had to continue without him, and that is the same as many families who lost their loved ones, and not only loved ones who were killed, but also loved ones who came back from the war never the same again because of the mental anguish that they had seen and faced. So when for the millennium, English Heritage were planning a memorial to my grandfather at Dover Castle, I was helping the sculptor of the piece that they decided of my grandfather. I was helping the artist with family resemblance and photos, and this was the product, and he stands looking out to Dunkirk. And I thought, of course, it's bronze. There's going to be a cast. We could commission a second edition. So I commissioned this one here, and it is kind of his perpetual retirement at the retirement home he was never able to enjoy. My wife and I decided to open this museum, Admiral Ramsay Museum, about 5 years ago, after my father had died, and we felt it was important to really move forward for today's children the stories of World War II, and because my grandfather was so involved in them in a leadership role, he is really a prism through which everyone can learn about the incredible operations of World War II. The museum is now open from May till September annually, 7 days a week, 9 o'clock till 4:30. Come along, enjoy the gardens, the museum, bring the dogs, bring the kids. Importantly, that's the generation that needs to know about the incredible sacrifice of so many people in World War II.